Welcome to today's deep dive. To start, may God bless your day and your entire week as you listen.
Yes, absolutely.
We're setting out on a really deeply fascinating exploration today. We're looking at texts that kind of fundamentally redefine how we understand the mechanics of divine promises.
And the very nature of belief itself, really.
Exactly. We are diving into Genesis chapter 15. And to guide our analysis, we're drawing from the comprehensive commentary in the Holman Study Bible, along with the study notes from the NAA, which is the Nova Almeida Actualizada Study Bible.
Two really fantastic, rich sources for this.
They really are. And we are going to jump straight into the tension of the narrative because, the context here is everything.
Oh, 100%.
Abram has just returned from this massive military victory in the previous chapter, right? But he makes a shocking, seemingly counterintuitive decision. He completely rejects a vast fortune offered to him by the king of Sodom.
He just walks right away from it.
Walks away from all the spoils of war. And the NAA notes make it clear that it's in the immediate aftermath of walking away from that staggering wealth that God approaches him.
The timing of that encounter is it's everything. The Holman commentary highlights the profound significance of this specific moment. Because this is actually the very first time we see Abram functioning as a prophet.
Really? The very first time?
Yeah. Furthermore, it's the first time the word vision is used in this specific way, denoting a direct divine revelation.
Wow.
God steps into Abram's reality and says, "Do not be afraid. I am your shield and your very great reward."
Your very great reward. That's a direct callback to what he just gave up.
Exactly. The theological implication there is immense. God is essentially telling Abram that by giving up the worldly compensation from a human king, he hasn't lost anything at all. God himself is his ultimate protection and his ultimate compensation.
But the reality of Abram's situation, it casts a heavy shadow over that promise.
It really does.
You'd assume that after receiving a direct personal vision from God, Abram would immediately fall to his knees in gratitude.
Right, just say thank you and be thrilled.
Yeah, but instead, he experiences this moment of profound despair. He looks at his life and points out a pretty glaring issue. What good is a cosmic reward if he doesn't have a single heir to leave it to?
It's a very practical concern.
It is. He reminds God that he's old, he remains completely childless, and according to the customs of his time, his entire estate is going to be inherited by a servant in his household, a man named Eliezer of Damascus.
It's a stunningly vulnerable moment of human struggle. And there's a brilliant layer of irony embedded in the text right here, which the NAA study notes point out.
Oh, I love this part.
Yeah, the name Eliezer literally translates to God is help.
God is help.
Right. So consider the psychological weight of that for a second. You have Abram standing before the Creator, expressing how entirely hopeless his legacy is, all while his current default heir's name is a walking, breathing reminder that God provides help.
That is just incredible irony.
Yet, in this specific crisis regarding his future, Abram feels entirely abandoned by circumstances. It perfectly captures how immediate physical realities can completely obscure our spiritual vision.
God doesn't respond to that despair with a harsh correction, though.
No, he doesn't scold him at all.
Instead, he meets Abram's anxiety with a staggering visual. He brings Abram outside into the night and tells him to look up at the starry sky. He challenges Abram to count the stars if he's even able to, and then declares, "So shall your offspring be."
It's a breathtaking promise. Descendants so numerous they defy human calculation.
And that visual is what triggers one of the most critical theological anchors in the entire biblical text, right?
Yes, absolutely. We find it in verse 6, which simply states, Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness.
Such a famous verse.
For good reason. The study notes emphasize that faith, in this historical and theological context, is not merely intellectual agreement.
Right, it's not just him doing the math.
Exactly. It's not Abram looking at the stars and saying, yes, I suppose that is statistically possible. It's a profound, active trust in God's character and God's word, precisely when the biological and physical circumstances dictate that the promise is humanly impossible.
Hold on, I want to pause right there, because this is a massive concept for the listener to grasp. If Abram is credited as righteous simply because he believed this promise about having a son, where does all the subsequent religious obedience, the moral frameworks, the complex laws, where does all that come in later?
That is the exact tension the later biblical writers grapple with.
How do the sources explain that tension between simple belief and active obedience?
Well, the commentary emphasizes that this single moment becomes the absolute paradigm for the Christian experience. In fact, this specific verse is cited in 3 distinct major New Testament books.
Romans, Galatians, and James, right?
You got it. The Apostle Paul uses this verse in Romans and Galatians to build the argument that justification, being made right with God, happens through faith alone, entirely apart from the law, because the law didn't even exist yet in Abram's time.
Abram wasn't following a checklist of rules. He was simply trusting God.
Right. But then, the book of James uses the exact same verse to argue that genuine faith is never stagnant. James points out that Abram's initial internal belief was eventually completed and proven by his later incredibly difficult actions.
So it's both.
Exactly. Righteousness here is defined not as flawless moral perfection, but as a life oriented toward God in trusting reliance.
So Abram demonstrates this monumental, history-altering trust regarding the promise of a son. But then the narrative shifts from the promise of an heir to the promise of real estate. God promises Abram the land of Canaan.
And suddenly, Abram's towering faith seems to waver.
Yeah. He asks for a tangible sign. He asks, Lord God, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?
He wants proof.
What does God do in response to that request for proof? Does he offer another cosmic vision with the stars?
Actually, no. God asks for livestock.
Livestock.
God instructs Abram to bring a heifer, a goat, and a ram, and he specifically mandates that they all must be exactly 3 years old. Alongside the mammals, he requests a dove and a pigeon.
Okay.
Then Abram takes the larger animals, cuts them perfectly in half, and arranges the severed, bloody halves on the ground opposite one another.
He just slices them in half.
Right down the middle, leaving a pathway between the carcasses. The birds he leaves whole, but places them opposite each other as well.
Why on earth would God ask for a slaughterhouse scene? I mean, if someone wants a guarantee on a piece of land today, they get a deed notarized? This seems incredibly gruesome and entirely out of place for a divine guarantee.
It is deeply unsettling to a modern reader, I agree. But the study notes provide vital historical context that makes sense of the gore.
Okay, lay it on me.
First, requiring the animals to be exactly 3 years old meant they were in their absolute prime. These were robust, highly valuable specimens. This wasn't a matter of offering God the cheapest animals available.
That makes sense.
But more importantly, the act of severing them and creating a path is a well-documented ancient ritual known as a self-maledictory oath.
A self-maledictory oath. So an oath where you are actively calling down a curse upon yourself.
Precisely. In the cultural context of the ancient Near East, when two parties, like two kings or a suzerain and a vassal, wanted to forge a binding, unbreakable treaty, they did not sign parchment. They performed this exact ritual.
They walk through the animals.
Yes. Both parties would physically walk down the pathway between the bleeding animal halves. The symbolism was visceral and unambiguous. By walking through the blood, they were publicly declaring, if I fail to uphold the exact terms of this covenant, may I be violently torn apart just as these animals have been.
Wow.
It was a solemn guarantee where your very life was staked on your word.
Wait, if this is a standard ancient contract ritual with a fixed legal meaning, how do the sources reconcile that with the alternative interpretation you find in some commentaries?
Ah, you mean the metaphorical reading.
Right. The NAA notes suggest that the divided animals actually represent the descendants of Abram, the future Israelites, and the birds of prey that swoop down to eat the carcasses, which Abram has to actively chase away, represent the foreign enemies that will try to devour Israel.
And the fire that eventually comes represents God.
Yeah.
Fair.
Isn't it a bit of a stretch to say it's both a rigid legal contract and a fluid historical metaphor?
It's a great observation, but the NAA commentary suggests that ancient biblical texts frequently operate on multiple, overlapping layers of meaning simultaneously.
Oh, interesting.
On a literal, historical level, God is stooping down to communicate with Abram using a legal framework that Abram perfectly understands, the blood covenant. But prophetically, the imagery functions as a living metaphor for the next millennium of Israel's history.
So the vultures are a warning.
Exactly. The fact that Abram has to spend hours fending off vultures from the torn flesh of the animals foreshadows the agonizing reality that the nation of Israel will face constant existential threats from surrounding empires. The ritual itself becomes a dramatic rehearsal of their future suffering and divine protection.
Sitting there with the severed animals, fending off scavengers under the hot sun that paints an incredibly tense picture.
It's like exhausting just to think about.
And that tension only escalates as the day ends. The text says that as the sun goes down, Abram falls into a deep sleep. But it's not described as just drifting off from exhaustion. The text describes a deep, terrifying darkness falling over him.
Yes.
What exactly is happening to him in this moment?
The Hebrew language used here is highly specific and illuminating. The Holman notes highlight that the term for this deep sleep is tardima.
Or Dima.
Right. It's a rare word that implies a supernaturally induced, overwhelming trance. In fact, it is the exact same word used back in Genesis chapter 2 when God placed Adam into a deep sleep to surgically create Eve.
Oh, wow. I never made that connection.
Abram isn't taking a nap. He is being submerged into a dreadful, overwhelming darkness so that God can communicate a profound and incredibly difficult truth about the future.
And the truth God reveals in that terrifying darkness is a bitter prophecy. God tells Abram that his descendants are going to be foreigners in a land that is not their own. They are going to be enslaved and afflicted for 400 years.
Which is a very long time.
Centuries. The study notes mention that this 400 is a round number, aligning with the 430 years the Israelites will eventually spend in Egypt before the Exodus. But God also promises they will ultimately emerge from that centuries-long enslavement with great wealth.
It's a staggering burden to place on Abram. He is finally receiving the firm guarantee of a legacy, but it comes inextricably linked to the knowledge that his own flesh and blood will endure generations of immense, systemic suffering before the promise of the land is actually realized.
But God gives a very specific, almost mysterious reason for why there has to be a 4-century delay before Abram's family can actually take possession of the land of Canaan.
Yes, the Amorites.
Right. God states that they cannot return yet because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Who exactly are the Amorites, and why does their level of iniquity dictate the timeline of God's promise to Abram?
This detail provides one of the most profound insights into the nature of divine justice in all of the ancient texts. The term Amorites is used here as a broad designation for the various pagan populations currently inhabiting the land of Canaan.
Okay, the current locals.
By saying their iniquity is not yet full, God is revealing his extraordinary patience. He is stating unequivocally that he will not arbitrarily or unjustly remove the Amorites from their land simply to make room for Abram's family.
So God is essentially waiting for them to reach a specific threshold of wickedness.
Yes, God is going to wait 4 generations. He's granting the Amorite civilization centuries of time. He will wait until their societal wickedness, their moral corruption, reaches a breaking point where divine judgment and their subsequent violent removal from the land is entirely morally justified.
That is fascinating.
It dismantles the ancient concept of a capricious deity who plays favorites without regard for justice.
That dramatically shifts how you have to read the eventual conquest of Canaan hundreds of years later under Joshua. It wasn't a sudden, unprovoked invasion. It was a divine judgment that had been delayed with immense patience for 400 years.
Exactly.
On one hand, you have this beautiful promise to Abram's family, but on the other, you have this sobering demonstration of God's objective justice toward the rest of the world.
God's covenant with his chosen patriarch does not override his absolute moral justice regarding the nations. The promise to Abram is secure, but the execution of that promise must align with God's righteous timing.
So Abram is paralyzed in this deep, dreadful sleep, digesting this massive, terrifying prophecy about his descendants' enslavement and the eventual judgment of the Amorites. And then we reach the absolute climax of the chapter.
His main event.
It's pitch black. The sun is completely set. And suddenly, moving through the darkness, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch appear out of nowhere.
These objects are classic biblical symbols of a theophany, a visible physical manifestation of God's presence.
Like the pillar of fire later on.
Exactly. We see this imagery echo later in the book of Exodus, with God leading the Israelites through the wilderness as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, an ancient portable oven billowing smoke, and a blazing torch represent the consuming, inescapable, holy presence of God himself moving over the earth.
And here is the detail that the entire chapter has been building toward. The smoking firepot and the flaming torch begin to move down the pathway, passing between the bloody severed halves of the animals.
But they pass through the pieces alone.
Right. Abram is completely incapacitated. Abram remains on the sidelines in a supernatural sleep. He never walks through the blood.
Which brings us to the ultimate implication of this entire narrative. Remember the cultural context of the self-maledictory oath we talked about.
Where both parties have to walk the path.
Yes. In a standard ancient Near Eastern treaty, both parties had to walk the path of blood. Both were conditionally bound to the terms, and both accepted the curse of death if they failed to uphold their end of the bargain.
But God walks it alone.
By passing through the severed pieces absolutely alone, God is fundamentally altering the nature of the contract. He is making the covenant entirely unconditional.
He is taking 100% of the burden and the potential penalty onto himself.
Precisely. By walking alone, God is effectively saying, I will fulfill this promise of the land and the descendants. And if this covenant fails, whether because of my failure or even because of your descendants' future failures, may the violent curse of these severed animals fall entirely upon me.
That is so powerful.
It is a breathtaking, unilateral guarantee. God signs the contract alone, bearing the full weight of the responsibility and the full horror of the curse.
The theological weight of that is staggering. To consider the creator of the universe legally binding himself to a promise with a human being and voluntarily taking the ultimate curse of failure upon himself if the humans break the terms.
It's unlike anything else in ancient literature.
And right after this monumental cosmic oath is sworn, God immediately grounds the vision back into hard reality by drawing the literal real estate borders of the promise.
He gets very specific.
He declares that the land will stretch from the river of Egypt, which the NAA notes clarify is most likely a reference to the Wadi El Arish. It's a massive seasonal riverbed serving as the traditional southern boundary of Canaan rather than the main Nile River.
Right, that distinction is important.
And it stretches all the way up north to the great river, the Euphrates. And he explicitly lists 10 different ancient people groups, including the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, whose vast territories this currently encompasses.
It anchors this grand, fiery, supernatural vision right back down into tangible dirt and geography. It proves that this isn't merely an abstract spiritual metaphor. It is a physical, historical promise of land, sustenance, and security for a real people.
It's massive.
The sheer scale of the borders God describes from the Wadi El Arish to the Euphrates encompasses a vast territory that wouldn't even begin to be fully realized by the Israelites until centuries later, perhaps briefly during the reign of King Solomon.
What an incredible intellectual and theological journey this single chapter takes us on.
It really is a masterpiece of a text.
We started with Abram feeling completely afraid and trapped in profound despair because he had no biological heir. We explored the foundational definition of faith, that trusting God's character when circumstances seem impossible is credited as righteousness.
A concept that changed the entire New Testament.
Absolutely. We navigated the visceral horror of an ancient blood oath, the deep sleep of Tardama, and a terrifying prophecy of 4 centuries of enslavement. And it all culminated in that breathtaking image of God walking the path of the curse alone, securing Abram's future with an unconditional guarantee.
It truly serves as a masterclass in understanding the enduring nature of biblical faith and the unshakable character of God's promises. It demonstrates that genuine faith is very often forged in the dark, in the agonizing periods of waiting, and in learning to trust a God who voluntarily takes the ultimate burden of the relationship entirely upon himself.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on and explore on your own. Consider the stark reality that Abram never actually saw this grand land promise fully realized in his own lifetime.
Not even close.
He was given a brilliant vision of the stars, a massive geographical promise, and a truly frightening prophecy about the suffering of his great-grandchildren. How does it change your own perspective on your life, your struggles, and your ambitions when you realize that the greatest promises you hold on to and the faith you're practicing today might actually be laying the essential groundwork for generations you will never even meet?
It challenges us to look at the legacy of our own belief through a much wider, longer lens.
It really does. May God bless all of you listening.